Night of July 15th, 1944. 4 miles south of Beachy Head, Lieutenant Herman Ernst rolls a big, black, twin-boomed American fighter into a dive at a bomb that is already flying. The bomb is crossing the English Channel at 2,500 feet, riding a yellow jet of flame at 350 miles an hour. It carries nearly a ton of high explosive, and it is aimed at London. It does not weave. It does not tire. It cannot be frightened. To kill it, Ernst has to chase it downhill, match its speed, and close to 900 feet. Point-blank range against a warhead. He has already tried once. The night before, in this same dive, the slipstream crushed his fighter's tail cone like a paper cup, and he limped home without firing a shot. The ground crews patched the tail. Now he is back, and the flame is filling his windscreen. Behind him, face pressed into a rubber viewing hood, sits the man who found this bomb in the dark. Radar operator Edward Copsall. The squadron calls him the Mouse. The fighter they share carries a name on its nose, Borrowed Time, and the name is not a joke. The man who sat in Copsall's seat before him is dead. Ernst has already come down by parachute once. Ernst's thumb settles on the firing button. And before the guns speak, you should know what rides in the nose of that black fighter. A box so secret that for years America refused to let it fly anywhere the enemy might pull it from a wreck. A box that exists because, one evening in a Washington hotel, American science admitted it was beaten. This is the story of the men who took that box hunting. Part 1. The Robot Summer. 1 week after the Allies landed in Normandy, the first flying bombs fell on London. The defences tracked them under the code name Diver. The public called them doodlebugs. By midsummer they were coming day and night, faster than most fighters, too small for most radars, and utterly indifferent to weather, darkness, or fear. Daylight belonged to the Tempests and Spitfires, to the gun belts and the balloon cables. The dark belonged to whoever could see in it. In mid-July, 6 crews of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, the first American Night Fighter Squadron in the European theatre, brought their P-61 Black Widows down to Ford Airfield on the south coast, with orders their own historians summed up in one line: to do battle with the buzz bombs. The rest of the squadron met the weapon before it ever reached its own aircraft. Moving south by troop train that same week, the men changed stations in London amid what their diary calls a flurry of buzz bombs, standing in packed corridors, listening for the moment a passing engine growl overhead would cut out. When the motor stopped, the bomb was coming down. Nobody on that train needed a briefing on why the night patrols mattered. The hunting method was simple and ugly. The Widow patrolled above the bomb's track. When the ground controller called one in, the radar operator picked the flame out of the night on his scope, and the pilot dove, trading altitude for the speed he did not otherwise have. Then he crept up behind a ton of Amatol and opened fire from inside the blast radius. That is the dive Herman Ernst is holding, 4 miles south of Beachy Head, on the night this story began. The bomb rides at 2,500 feet. Borrowed Time slides in behind it. 900 feet. The 420mm cannon fire. The flame staggers, tips, and the channel swallows it. Copsall had never lost the bomb on his scope through the whole screaming descent, calling the closure while the airframe shuddered around him. The kill went into the books as a team score because at night there was no other kind. And in the squadron's own ledger, that splash made history twice. The first victory of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, and the first kill ever credited to a P-61 Black Widow in the European War. The price tag for that kind of shooting arrived 5 days later. Captain Tadas Spellis and his radar operator, Lieutenant Eleftheron, a name the squadron sensibly shortened to Lefty, were flying the Widow they called Katie the Kid. A bomb crossed below them. One of the men who flew these patrols described what it looked like. The familiar glow, like a full moon traveling many times faster than a locomotive. Spellis dove. Lefty's voice walked the distance down the intercom. 1,500 feet. 1,000. 800. 600. At 400 feet, Spellis fired, and a split second later, in his squadron's words, all hell broke loose. The warhead detonated 450 feet in front of the aircraft. Katie the Kid flew straight through the explosion and came out the other side with her ailerons mangled and the fabric scorched off half her tail. Spellis wrestled her home. There was a passenger aboard that night, an intelligence officer named Phil Goober, who had come along to see what the V-1 work was like. He found out. 5 flying bombs fell to the detachment that summer. Every man in the detachment understood the arithmetic. The difference between a kill and a fireball you fly through was a few hundred feet of judgment, called out by a man staring into a rubber hood. That success raised a harder question. In a sky with no moon, no horizon, and no lights, how does a fighter find anything at all? Every man on that detachment knew the answer was bolted into the nose of his aircraft. Almost none of them knew it had been born out of a confession of failure. Part 2. The Dead End. Late September 1940. The Wardman Park Hotel, Washington, D.C. Britain is being bombed every night. France is gone, and in a closed room, a committee of America's best radio engineers is meeting a small British delegation that has crossed the U-boat Atlantic carrying a locked metal box. The Americans went first. They showed their visitors the best microwave transmitter the United States had built, a Klystron working at the prized wavelength of 10 centimeters, short enough in theory to fit a precision radar into an aircraft's nose. It produced a few tens of watts. By the account of the men who were in the room, the American side admitted they had reached a dead end. Then the British opened the box. Inside sat a device you could hold in your palm, a cavity magnetron, and when they ran it up, it delivered roughly 10 kilowatts at 10 centimeters. Not a refinement, a 1,000-fold leap. One device, brought as a gift, because Britain could not build it in quantity while bombs were falling on its factories. What happened next happened fast. Within weeks, a new laboratory took over a building at MIT, staffed by physicists who would spend the war turning that British palmful of power into American production. Its very first project was the box this story is about. A hunting radar small enough for a night fighter's nose, built by Western Electric, designated SCR-720. The Army graded its secrecy the simplest way it knew how. For years, the set was banned from flying over territory where the enemy might reach a crash site. America would rather blindfold its own night fighters than let Germany see how the eye worked. The squadron built to carry it was just as new. The 422nd formed in Florida in 1943 around a training cadre from Orlando. Its commanding officer, Horace B. Johnson, was 23 years old, and the squadron called him the Old Man because he was the oldest officer on the books. They trained at night in war-weary twin-engine planes over swamp and ocean, and the night training did what night training always does. On Christmas Eve, 1943, 2 of those planes met in mid-air near the Banana River. Flight Officer James Laundrie, flying as Herman Ernst's radar operator, did not come home. Ernst did by parachute. A crewman named Lawrence Borgia died in the same collision. The squadron buried its first dead half a year before most of it had seen a German. In February 1944, they sailed for England, the first American night fighter squadron in the theater, the first anywhere with the P-61 Black Widow. And there they discovered that their most determined opponent that spring spoke English. A faction of senior officers had never wanted the Black Widow at all, and by late June 1944, the campaign to replace her peaked. Colonel Winston Kratz, director of night fighter training in the United States, dropped what the squadron's historian called the astounding news. The P-61 was not good enough for combat, and the 422nd was to be handed some 60 British Mosquitoes. Kratz backed his judgment with a wager of $500 in gold that the Mosquito would outfly the Widow. The crew's answer went into their diary. One fact was clear: We just had to make good. It went up to General Spaatz, who ordered the matter settled the old way. A fly-off. July 5th, 1944, at Herne. A Royal Air Force Mosquito and crew from 125 Squadron against an American Black Widow flown by Lieutenant Donald Doyle and radar operator Norman Williams. The Widow proved faster, outturned the Mosquito, in her crew's words, by a big margin, and outclimbed her. The squadron's diary allowed itself one line of pure joy. A most enjoyable afternoon. Kratz paid off. And the re-equipment. We never heard any more of it, the historian wrote. The Black Widow had won a stay of execution. 2 footnotes belong to that afternoon. The first, the general most associated with the Mosquito option, was a fast-rising American commander named Hoyt Vandenberg. Hold that name, it comes back at Christmas. The second is quieter. Donald Doyle and Norman Williams, the crew who saved the Black Widow, are both on the squadron's memorial list. Missing in action. The war did not let them read the scoreboard they made possible. Part 3. The Trade. The squadron's combat war had opened quietly 2 nights before the fly-off settled its fate. At 22:20 on the button, their diary records, a Black Widow named No Love, No Nothing, roared down the runway, with the commanding officer himself at the controls. The first mission of the 1st American Night Fighter Squadron in the European theater had begun. They patrolled the invasion coast from Le Havre to Barfleur, stacked in among some 30 RAF Mosquitoes, which their historian compared to fishing from a crowded party boat. The Germans declined to show. The flak did not. And once, when an aircraft slid in behind them in the dark before identifying itself as friendly, the diary notes that the radar operator really started to pant over the intercom. That was the trade they had signed up for. Hours of cold nothing, punctured by seconds in which the night itself seemed to pick a side. A night interception only became a dogfight in its final seconds. Until then, it was a relay race run in the dark, and the squadron had a rule about it. No night fighter unit is any better than its control. For the 422nd, the voice in the night was usually a controller called Marmite, watching a screen the size of a dinner plate, sorting the slow worms of light that were friendly bombers from the one worm that was not. Then the handoff, a heading, an altitude, a distance. From there, the race belonged to the man in the back of the Widow. A radar operator in another Black Widow squadron put it flatly after the war. There was nothing automatic about the SCR-720. No lock-on, no tracking computer, 2 small cathode tubes, a thumb switch to tilt the antenna's sweep, and a human brain to hold the whole moving picture together. The pilot had his own discipline to keep. Fly the turns smooth, or the picture in the back dissolves and the blip is gone. Done right, Marmite brought you to 3 miles, the scope took you the rest of the way, and the pilot looked up at last to find a black shape against blacker cloud, close enough to count exhaust flames. Identification first, always. Then the 4 cannon in the belly spoke for about 2 seconds. Even the bookkeeping was its own small drama. A kill at night fell into a darkness that kept secrets. So, when Lieutenant Paul Smith of the 422nd scored, his radar operator, Robert Tierney, remembered him keying the radio and shouting, "Murder, murder, murder, give me a fix." Then they would orbit the spot while the controller plotted it, so that in the morning a reconnaissance aircraft could go out and photograph the wreck. No photograph, no witness, no claim. On August 7th, 1944, the system produced its first full result. Lieutenant Raymond Anderson and radar operator John Morris ran the relay to its end over Normandy and shot down a German aircraft, the first night air-to-air credit by an American crew in the European theater. The Germans, for their part, had begun to study the new black fighter, and the squadron's record preserves one attempt to collect a specimen. A German aircraft let Smith and Tierney chase it, staying just ahead, never escaping, never quite turning, for the better part of 30 minutes. Dragging the Widow lower and lower, until the night around them lit up. They had been led into a killing field of light anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. The Widow came home on one engine with 87 holes in her. The Germans did not get their specimen. The British took some convincing too. When an RAF investigator suggested one American claim had really been a friendly Mosquito, the squadron walked him politely through the times and distances until the idea collapsed. We never saw him again, their diary notes. Through the autumn, the squadron moved with the front, from Normandy to Châteaudoun, taking over the night defense of the American sectors. When the Luftwaffe stayed home, the Widows went hunting trains, and the squadron's tally of locomotives began to climb past its tally of aircraft. By December, they sat on a freezing plateau in Belgium, Florennes, airfield. A 78, 16 Black Widows on the books, a number that would soon turn out to be a work of fiction. Eastward, behind the hills and the fog, something enormous was quietly lining up. Part 4. 10 Nights. The night of December the 16th opened almost normally. Then the small wrongnesses began to pile up. Too many flares on the horizon, too many radar contacts that refused to turn into anything. And strangest of all, German aircraft flying with their navigation lights on as if the dark belonged to them again. Just after 1 in the morning, a 422nd crew caught up with one of the lighted aircraft. It was a Focke-Wulf 190, and the squadron's diary records its fate in 3 words: shot down forthwith. Before dawn, another crew ran their score to 3 in a single night, and one of their victims, a Heinkel, was flying as a transport. The men watching it burn could see windows down the length of its fuselage. Elmore and Mapes added a kill of their own, and Hermann Ernst and the Mouse closed the night with a Junkers 87 dive bomber, the first of the low, slow Stukas the squadron had ever managed to pin down. The intelligence van, their historian wrote, was like a locker room after the Sugar Bowl. Nobody went to bed. By morning, the map had a name on it: von Rundstedt's offensive. The Germans had torn the American line open in the Ardennes, and the only Allied aircraft that could work in that weather at night were 2 squadrons of Black Widows. The weather collected its own payment immediately. The next night, the fog came down in waves, and the cost was heavy. The commanding officer landed at a neighboring field between a strafing Junkers 88 and the Mosquito chasing it. Lieutenant Siegel refused permission to land, crashed half a mile off another runway. They cut him out of the wreck an hour later, bruised and alive. Lieutenants Ali and Heggie, orbiting in the same fog, radioed that they would try somewhere else. They crashed 4 miles east of the field. Both were killed. The plane, the diary says, was in bits and pieces. For 3 nights after that, the squadron was grounded and had to take it, while von Rundstedt's wave lapped westward. The order came down from headquarters that Florennes would be defended at all cost. Clerks, cooks, and armourers were issued rifles and assigned sectors. Their historian asked the obvious question: what were we to do with small arms against von Rundstedt's forces? A daylight reconnaissance on the 22nd answered why anyone was asking. A German column was making for the Meuse, 32 miles from the field. That night, in the gaps between fog banks, Robert Elmore held his fire on a Messerschmitt 110 until the range had closed inside 100 feet. He was making certain, the diary says. The squadron did not call him Killer for nothing. At 100 feet, the kill and the blast wave arrived together. His Widow flew through the explosion of his own victory and came off, in their words, second best. She also came home. South of them, a town called Bastogne was now a circle on German maps. Inside the circle, the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded, was invited to surrender, and answered with the most famous single word any American said that winter. The Luftwaffe's response was less quotable. Night after night, German aircraft bombed the town, the aid stations and cellars included. The night of December 24th was the worst of it. That is not a film script's idea of drama. It is what the commander of the 101st himself reported. German aircraft had caused his men serious trouble, bombing and strafing on the night before Christmas. The Widows were aloft that same Christmas Eve. Anderson and Mogan, in a fighter called Tennessee Ridge Runner, were vectored onto a Junkers 88 half an hour into their patrol. Mogan locked it on the scope at 3 miles. Anderson closed to 800 feet, then 500. 2 bursts of 20mm hammered into the bomber's right-wing route, and then at the worst possible moment, the guns jammed. What followed, in Anderson's telling, was a running dogfight all the way down to 500 feet above the dark hills, the American wrestling with his armament switches, while the German tried everything he knew. The guns came back. The Junkers navigation lights went out, and it was last seen at 1,500 feet in a lazy, dying orbit. They broke off at 5 minutes to 8 in the evening and had to settle for a probable. Christmas night, Anderson and Mogan squared the account with a confirmed kill, redeeming themselves, in the diary's words, for the one that got back to tell the tale. At Florence, Christmas Day was, in the squadron's words, that in name only, though the cooks did get turkey onto the tables between alerts. And that night, and the next, the Black Widows went south, into the flak over the Bulge, and put themselves between the bombers and Bastogne. Then came the 26th. For the 3rd month running, their historian wrote, the 26th proved a big night. Just about everything happened. Paul Smith and Robert Tierney took off, and came back having destroyed 2 Junkers 188s in a single sortie. That made 5 victories together. Their squadron counted them the first American night fighter aces in the European theater. Hermann Ernst and the Mouse found another Ju-188 crawling north at 2,000 feet, straight and level. Ernst closed to 500 feet. Then, in his own words, the 20mm rounds raked his fuselage, and at the same time his dorsal turret gunner opened up on us. Ernst broke hard to starboard, out of the gunner's stream, slid back in astern and below, and finished it. The clock in the combat report read 25 minutes past midnight, December 27th. Victory number 3 for the crew of Borrowed Time. The same night gave as hard as it took. Pete Heimelreich went down in flames 9 miles from the field. His radar operator Molinari got out by parachute. Danielson and Fiala overshot a Stuka and paid for it. With his radar operator wounded and, he believed, unconscious in the back, Danielson put the Widow down inside friendly lines, in the only flat space available, which happened to be an ammunition dump near Marche. He was hurt in the landing. Fiala, it turned out, had already bailed out and was picked up safe with a leg wound. And then the war walked onto the field itself. A lone Messerschmitt 1-1. Oh, the visitor the men called the Bedcheck Hun followed the headlights of a jeep coming from the mess hall and strafed the squadron's own street. A man named Waterfield lost a leg to a 20mm shell. 50 feet to the right, the diary notes, and the burst would have gone through the crowded operations vans. The German circled for a second pass. He did not finish it. A night fighter took him down just north of the field, and the squadron's intelligence section got a grim new proverb out of the evening about what happens to those who make 2 passes. On the 27th, the last flying night of the year, Spellis and Lefty finally got the Messerschmitt 1-1. Oh, they had been owed all month. The commanding officer took a Ju-188. Ernst damaged a Ju-88 and then shot his own nose wheel door off. The 3rd case of the door thing, the diary size, within 2 months. Now, set the scoreboard against the inventory. In 5 months of combat, the squadron had received exactly 1 replacement aircraft. Through the Bulge, of 16 Black Widows on paper, 4 would fly. Crews shared them, and the same airplane went out as many as 4 times a night. Kept alive by a supply sergeant with a gift for stumbling on caches of radar tubes and a maintenance chief who happened to hold an electrical engineering degree from Texas A&M, 16 on paper. 4 in the air. Remember that arithmetic when the December score appears. Because with 4 airplanes, in the worst flying weather of the war, the 422nd destroyed 18 German aircraft in December. The 6 RAF Night Fighter Squadrons on the continent, by the 422nd's own arithmetic, flew 10 times the aircraft and claimed 20. On January 4th, a letter reached the squadron, forwarded down the chain from 9th Air Force. It had been written on December 27th. The commanding general of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne wished to pass on the gratitude and thanks of his entire command. On the night of December 25th to 26th, Allied night fighters had, on several different occasions, broken up and driven off German night attacks on his positions. He forwards, the letter reads, "The thanks of the whole command for a job well done." The letter closed with the customary formula, "By command of Major General Vandenberg." The same Vandenberg whose preferred night fighter 6 months earlier had been the Mosquito. The squadron he had nearly re-equipped out of existence was now the squadron his headquarters thanked for Bastogne. Part 5. The Eye That Would Not Go Blind. One question has been waiting since the first minute of this story. Plenty of aircraft carried radar by 1944. Why did this box in this black fighter matter so much? Because by 1944, radar was a sense the enemy had learned to put out. The weapon was almost insultingly cheap. Bundles of foil strips, cut to match a radar's wavelength, tossed out by the thousand. The British called it window, the Germans called it duple, and it worked. Scopes whitened into a blizzard of false echoes, and the long-wave radars of the early war, British and German alike, never fully recovered. The box from the Washington Hotel was a different animal. Its tight 10-centimeter beam held a real aircraft's shape on the scope while the foil smeared and drifted, and the Army Air Force's own historians reached for a phrase you will almost never see them use: generally invulnerable to enemy jamming. You do not have to take America's word for it. On August 23, 1943, the head of the Royal Air Force, Air Chief Marshal Portal, wrote to General Arnold asking for SCR-720 sets for Britain's own night fighters, because their microwave length made them far less vulnerable to window. The letter sits in the Army's files to this day, under reference A-A-G 413.44 radar. The nation that had handed America the Magnetron in a locked box in 1940 was writing back 3 years later to ask for the finished weapon. The RAF flew it to the end of the war as AI Mark 10. Were the Widow's scopes ever actually snowed over the Ardennes? The records are silent, and silence is what an honest story reports. What the records are not silent about is what that eye allowed. Squadron Commander Orris Johnson once took on a flight of 3 Focke-Wulf 190s alone in the dark, by his own account, because he had radar eyes and the Focke-Wulf pilots did not. There was a December night when his controller offered him 8 FW-190s flying in formation. 8, he decided, was too many to mess with. The remarkable part is that the decision was his to make. The full ledger of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, July 1944 to May 1945, reads like this: 43 German aircraft destroyed in the air. And the claim sheet behind that number reads like a Luftwaffe inventory. Junkers 88s and 188s above all. Messerschmitt night fighters, lumbering Ju-52 transports, Heinkels, Focke-Wulfs, Stukas, even one of the big Heinkel 177 bombers. Plus 5 flying bombs over the channel, 1,576 sorties, and 1 presidential unit citation for the Ardennes, December 16th through 26th, announced on May 7th, 1945. The squadron heard about it, their historian noted, on the next to the last day of the war in Europe, and called it a distinct and much welcomed surprise. Their own history makes one more claim, which nobody has ever taken away from them: the most successful American night fighter squadron of the war. The box itself outlived the shooting. SCR-720 sets flew on in British and American night fighters into the late 1940s, into the first jets, until newer eyes replaced them. The men scattered the way squadrons do. Orris Johnson, the 23-year-old old man of Florence, stayed in uniform and retired a major general. and the squadron's way of fighting 4 missions a night in any weather by instruments and a voice on the radio stopped being an oddity and became a doctrine. The Air Force that calls itself all-weather and around-the-clock learned the trade in places like A-78 from men flying 4 airplanes that should have been 16. A man named his fighter borrowed time because the seat behind him had already cost one friend everything, and because no one who flew toward a warhead at night on instruments and a stranger's voice expected the loan to run long. The loan ran, and the squadron paid it back with interest. 43 aircraft, 5 robot bombs, a surrounded division in Bastogne that got one less night of bombing because somebody's scope stayed clear overhead. The fates were not distributed by merit. James Laundrie died on Christmas Eve 1943, before the war ever showed him an enemy. Donald Ali and Richard Heggie died in the fog of the Bulge, looking for a runway. Donald Doyle and Norman Williams, the crew who outflew the Mosquito and saved the Black Widow itself, went missing before the end. Waterfield left a leg on a street in Florence. Herman Ernst and Edward Copsall lived, and their black fighter's name turned out to be a joke the war chose not to get. These facts are not from a movie studio. The squadron wrote its own history after the war. A few hundred pages of slang, scores, and dead friends' names, and we read it page by page so it would not stay buried in an archive index. James Laundrie has a headstone in Richmond, Virginia, because in 1951 his family filled out a government form asking for one. If tonight is the first time you have heard these names, leave one of them in the comments. Laundrie, Ali, Heggie, Doyle, Williams. The men of the 422nd believed nobody would remember any of this. Prove them wrong, and we will keep pulling stories like this one out of the files. Until then, keep your eyes on the dark.